Red Bull have found themselves in a very difficult situation after the Azerbaijan GP, having lost the lead in the Constructors Championship and seeing Max lose more ground to the next three drivers below him. The upcoming race in Singapore will pose an even bigger challenge for the Austrian team due to the low-speed corners as well as the bumpiness throughout the whole circuit. And with Mercedes not that far away from the mix, could we see a massive shed in Verstappen's lead in the Drivers' Championship? And if so, are these some of the early indicators that the Dutchman is ready for another adventure in his life away from Red Bull? Max Verstappen has been quite vocal about the issues that Red Bull met during the Baku GP, and the three-time world champion was not happy with the last-minute change of the setup of his car, which saw him being in a no-man's land. It's worth mentioning that Red Bull came with a floor upgrade here, which was more or less a combination of everything they've brought so far, because at least they know where they are bleeding out performance. And if we were to look at Perez's performance in Baku, we wouldn't really put Red Bull in such a bad spot. They were the clear fourth team in Monza, while here in Baku they were the third, as at least one of the Red Bull drivers was more competitive than Mercedes. But will this be a scenario that we're going to witness in Singapore? We must remind you that this is the only track that the RB19, one of the most dominant machines in the history of the sport, failed to conquer last year. And if this remains the same in 2024, then Red Bull is going to be in some serious trouble. Of course, a very positive sign is that Verstappen was quite quick through the low-speed corners in Baku, but this was mostly because his car had the high downforce wing, while the rest were compensating a bit due to the long main delta that provided excellent opportunities to overtake. Here in Singapore, every car will have a loaded rear wing, and it would be safe to say that the competition from the rest of the grid will be ramped up to a great extent. Another huge problem that the team would have to deal with is the changes of the car, because it's a clear indicator that while they do know where they are bleeding out performance, and while they were adamant that the new floor brought some positives to the remainder of the season, it is still a grey area and something they don't understand in terms of the car's setup. When talking about the entire weekend, Verstappen went on to say, "I think we just paid the price with the changes that we made into qualifying. That just made it really difficult to drive. The car was jumping around a lot, the wheels were coming off the ground in the corners. When you don't have a contact patch with the tarmac, it's very difficult. You try to make changes always to make the car better, but unfortunately what we did made it worse." But even for Max, not everything is negative from Baku, because we must not forget that he was quite competitive throughout the first two practice sessions, and he can be thanking not just Piastri and Leclerc for taking points away from Norris, but also Lando himself for having a qualifying session to forget and being kicked out in Q1, starting the race from P15 after Hamilton and Gasly received penalties. When talking about the new floor of the car, which is again a combination of everything that Red Bull has brought in this season, Verstappen went on to say, "The overall behaviour is better with the new floor. Unfortunately, we just made some wrong decisions going into qualifying and we paid the price for it. Yeah, I could have built more lead for Norris in the championship, but you can also turn it around. I think McLaren could have done a better job as well, right? So it is what it is." Red Bull are also assessing where it all went wrong, and Horner has traced it back to the Barcelona GP last year, which is quite an unusual period because the car was so dominant here, and if this proves to be true, it just goes to show how dormant the rest of the grid were in terms of finding solutions and innovations for their own problems. However, this was the race that started all of Perez's issues and even put his future at Red Bull at stake. But the Mexican driver's calls fell to deaf ears because Verstappen was dominating the rest of the grid with ease. Furthermore, Marco stated that in Imola this year, another wrong turn was taken with the car. But again, the engineering team led by Wash and Balbo weren't that worried because Verstappen went on to win the Imola GP and also won the Canadian and the Spanish GP, which gave them some sort of belief that the three-time world champion can extract everything out of the car regardless of its situation. But given the fact that in the past 7 races, the RB20 hasn't been the first car to cross the checkered flag and only scored podiums twice in this interval, now the Austrian team has a lot to think about for the foreseeable future. Upgrades are coming, that's determined, but they are not going to be for the upcoming race in Singapore, where the team hopes that the damage sustained will be minimal in the Drivers' Championship. One thing is for sure, Red Bull has given up all hopes in trying to retain the lead in the Constructors' Championship now that they've lost it to McLaren and are under a huge threat to lose it to Ferrari too, as Horner stated that from a position of the hunted, they are now the hunters for the last 7 races of the season. Even Toto Wolff went on to talk about the recent issues that are going on in Red Bull, because obviously he's had to deal with a car that didn't respond to anything that was mounted on it in the form of upgrades from 2022 to just about the middle of 2024. When talking about this, Wolff said, "You see the swings in performance from Ferrari you've seen at the beginning of the year. One would have said it's another Verstappen Red Bull runaway championship, but it collapsed. However, you can never write them off." And what all of this does is prove that there are no certainties in this sport, because from what we can see right now, Verstappen's lead to Norris stands at 59 points and Leclerc and Piastri aren't that far behind the Brit either. To say that the latter two have a shot at the championship is definitely something of a far-fetched scenario, because it would take both Norris and Verstappen to not finish races or score low numbers of points, while these two would go on to finish in a similar manner to Baku, Monza and Monaco on the top 2 positions, and it would still be very close in Verstappen's favour. What is also going in Verstappen's aid is the fact that neither one of his competitors has taken an engine penalty, and it's still unclear as to when that will happen in the remainder of the season, with the situation of not taking a 5th engine still being on the table, considering that the Mercedes and Ferrari engines proved to be quite reliable, to say the least. While 2025 is a secured year for Verstappen and Red Bull, if the season were to start right now, we would have seen that Verstappen wouldn't even be in the top 2 drivers with how he performed from Monaco onwards. In the last 10 races, the greatest number of points have been scored by the duo of McLaren, and with Piastri presenting himself as the future superstar of the team, 2025 will definitely be a year to show his true abilities when everything starts from ground zero, not to mention that this will be Hamilton's first year with Ferrari too. Therefore, Verstappen might be looking for a way out of Red Bull sooner rather than later. And when talking about this, Marco added more fuel to the fire, further stating, "Max drives where he can win. Aston Martin has the most modern factory. The wind tunnel will be operational next year, and Honda engines will be added to that. Everything fits. And if you look at history, it is clear that wherever Newey has gone, there has been an upward trend. I don't know why it should be any different at Aston Martin. Verstappen knows that he can win titles with us too if we can get through this World Championship now. That is also an absolute must." With all this in mind, do you think that Red Bull will struggle additionally in Singapore due to the issues that they've experienced in Baku with the performance of their car? And more importantly, do you think that they have what it takes to turn the season around from Austin onwards? Let us know in the comments below.